Hello, I'm Dr. David Adams, and welcome to the third part of our look at how we read and preach miracle texts effectively. In the first two parts of our study, we looked at some background issues, and then we talked about last time the importance of having an appropriate literary look at the text and an appropriate theological context in which to interpret it. In this session, we're going to look at an example of how to apply those to one of the miracles of Jesus and look specifically at Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 37. So thank you for joining me. We'll begin with the text, and here I'm just going to work from the ESV. We read, "From there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house, but did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him, and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, 'Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.' But she answered him, 'Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs.' And he said to her, 'For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter.' And she went home and found the child lying in a bed and the demon gone." The text continues with another scene. "Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, 'Ephphatha,' that is, 'be released.' And he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, 'He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak.'" So, how shall we approach this text, both to understand it as a miracle and to preach it effectively? We're going to begin by tending to the literary context. You remember in our last session, we pointed out that miracles tend to be secondary scenes or subplots within a larger narrative framework. In this case, the larger narrative framework is the whole life of Jesus and his ministry. And we suggested that we slow down and read the text with a view to identifying the conflict, the climax, and the resolution. So let's walk through these very quickly. First, what do we know about the problem here? How is it described in our text? Well, quite simply, in chapter 7, verses 24 to 30, the first scene, we have a child possessed of a demon. In the second scene, we have a man who was deaf and mute brought before Jesus. So those are the problems to be addressed. Secondly, how is the intercession described? In the first text, or the first part of the text, the intercession is a pleading by the girl's mother. In the second text, there's not as much pleading suggested, but we get the intercession of the friends of the man. The third thing we said we wanted to do was to attend to the context. So what is the context in which these miracles occur? The first part, verses 24 to 30, occur in the region of Tyre and Sidon. So let's just refresh our memory for a moment about a little biblical geography. Now, the last time that a place was given in the gospel, it was in the preceding chapter, and we found Jesus here at the city of Gennesareth, or Chinnereth. By the way, the Sea of Galilee is actually in the Old Testament called the Sea of Kinnereth. And Kinnereth is named for the lake, and Gennesareth is a Greek kind of distortion of the word Kinnereth. So Jesus was here on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And to get to where he's going, we don't know the exact route that he took, but most probably took the main highway going north, past Hatzor up to Dan, turning left, and then going out to the region of Tyre and Sidon on the coast in what is now southern Lebanon. Tyre is here. Sidon is about 22 miles further north. So in the first scene, we're told that Jesus is in this area, in the region of Tyre and Sidon. No specific town is identified. In the second of the scenes here, Jesus is in the Decapolis. And again, we're not given the name of a specific city, although some material from the other Gospels suggests it might be either the city of Gadara or the city of Gergasa. And these are on the eastern side of the Jordan River, just to the south of the Sea of Galilee. So to go back to the map that we were looking at just a moment ago, essentially what happens is after visiting the area of Tyre and Sidon, Jesus retraces his steps, assuming he went back the same way, and goes to the region of the Decapolis. Now, Decapolis is sort of a vague area, mostly on the eastern side of the Jordan and just to the south of the Dead Sea. It's called the Decapolis because there were 10 primary cities in this area. And we're not told which of the 10 or which village it was that Jesus might have visited. Probably, if I had to guess, I would probably guess Gergasa. That is up right on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, and that seems to fit both what's in other Gospels and what we have here, although, frankly, the exact location is probably not crucial to what happens. But the general location might be. Now, before we leave this map, I'd like to point out one other place that's not mentioned explicitly in our text. About 2/3 of the way north from Tyre to Sidon, there's a little village called Zarephath. Unlike Tyre and Sidon, which were both significant ports, Zarephath was a relatively minor place. But it does have one claim to fame. In the Old Testament, the prophet Elijah traveled there and encountered a widow and performed a significant miracle. And so I think we have to at least ask ourselves whether there could be any connection between what Jesus is doing in these miracles and what Elijah did in relation to the widow of Zarephath. So hold that thought, and we'll come back to it in just a minute. So now we've taken a look at the problem and the intercession, and we've very quickly described the context. So let's turn now to the climax of the story. Now, in the first scene, verses 24 to 30, Jesus demurs. He doesn't seem to be enthusiastic or want to help this woman. He tells her that, he's not in so many words, he's not interested in her problems. And this is kind of surprising to people, and it needs some explanation, perhaps, for most people today. I think the answer ultimately lies, or so the text tells us, in the fact that this was a Gentile. And Jesus is the Messiah, first and foremost, of the Old Testament people of God. What we learn in this text, this is important in this regard, is that Jesus' ministry also encompasses this Gentile woman. And that provides hope for us, that Jesus' ministry also includes us. In any case, Jesus responds to the entreaty of the woman after she expresses her conviction that he ought to help her, even though she is a Gentile, and he heals her daughter by driving out the demon. In the second episode, Jesus spits on his hands, touches the ears and the tongue, and opens the ears and the tongue, and says, "Ephrathah, be opened." And so the hearing and the speech of the man are restored. So Jesus performs two miracles, both of which are in the broad category of healing, although the girl, the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman, is not directly healed. She's indirectly healed by the casting out of the demon. So that's a quick look at the climax. Now, the resolution is also interesting because it's different in each case. There's really no resolution at all to the first of these. Jesus simply says to the woman, because you said this statement, you can go your way. The demon has left your daughter. And we're told when the woman got home, the girl was resting in bed and the demon was gone. So there's no reaction on the part of anyone, simply a straightforward action of Jesus to drive out the demon. Nothing further is said by him or by the woman. So it ends very abruptly. And probably that's because it's juxtaposed immediately with this second scene. And at the end of the second scene, after Jesus performs the miracle of healing, he charges them not to tell anyone. But of course they do, and we're told that the more that Jesus told them not to, the more that they did. It's to the point that everyone kind of recognized who Jesus was and identified him as a man of God who could heal. So that's a quick look at some of the key elements from the literary context. Now let's turn to the theological context and ask ourselves, which of these theological approaches that we identified in our last segment provides a good line for developing a sermon? Well, I think there's several possibilities here, and that's because it's not necessarily just one of these. Several of these could apply, and as I said last time, they often overlap. So one that kind of works for a great many miracles is this idea that the miracle constitutes evidence that Jesus is the Messiah. And that would certainly apply here, and especially in the second part where we get a clear recognition on the part of the audience that Jesus had the ability to do these miraculous things. Another possibility that always comes into play when we're dealing with miracles of healing is the idea of the compassion of Christ, namely that God loves his creation, has compassion on those who are suffering, and that would certainly be an appropriate theme in both of these cases, especially the first scene of dealing with the distraught mother. Some of these others are probably less effective. I'm not sure that the type of the resurrection is a particularly good one in this case. It's not really strong. There's nothing about the resurrection in the context, although to the extent that one might argue that all miracles are types of the resurrection, you could make that work. But it's a little more of a stretch in this case. There's less explicit material to draw on. The spiritual warfare theme is a possibility, but because we have a demon being driven out. But again, there's nothing in the text that really focuses on that or calls our attention to it. And so that too seems to be a little weaker in this case. There's no real lesson that's being taught. There's not a moral drawn from the story that we can obviously attend to. We could draw one from the first part about kind of the woman's continual entreaty of Jesus and how he eventually gave into her. But again, that's not something that the narrative especially highlights, and it's not a part of the second of these at all. It would work a little bit for the first one. As I said in the last segment, I kind of naturally tend in the direction of the theme of the arrival that the miracles announce the arrival of the kingdom, and especially the age of fulfillment. And here there are two of these three promises that are fairly prominent. The restoration of security theme that's associated with the restoration of Shabbat in the Old Testament often involves actions of healing, or the promise of God to be a healer and to wipe away suffering. So that comes into play here, as it would in any miracle of healing. Another element, the rule of God motif here, is also involved because we have the casting out of a demon, which would represent the victory of Jesus over those who oppose God, which is an element that's fairly common in the rule of God theme in the Old Testament. So we have two of the three elements associated with the restoration of Shabbat and the announcement of the arrival of the kingdom that could provide us the basis for a good sermon on that approach. But there's one other one I'd like to mention here, and that's the approach of prophet Christology. And for this, we want to go back and pick up the possible connection between Elijah and Jesus. So let's look at some potential things in the text that might serve this theme. If we juxtapose what Elijah did with the widow of Zarephath and what Jesus does in these two cases. First, if we ask the question, who is being, for whom is the miracle performed? In the case of Elijah, we have a woman with a child, a widow with a child specifically. In the case of Jesus, in the first part, we have a woman with a child. She's not said to be a widow, and we're not specifically told that she's in Zarephath, although Zarephath is in the region of Tyre and Sidon, so there's a geographic connection there. We're not told that she's a widow, but she is a woman who is at least apparently on her own. In the second part here, we have an unknown Gentile man. And in fact, in all three of these cases, it's almost certain that we're dealing with Gentiles. In Elijah's case, we certainly were. In Jesus' case, we're told that the woman was a Gentile. In the case of the man, in the second scene, we're not told that he's a Gentile, but he is from this Transjordanian area of the Decapolis, and so there's a very good chance that he was probably a Gentile. So there's a connection here both between the woman-child part and the Gentile part. Another possible connection lies in the occasion for these miracles. In Elijah's case, you'll remember that he's forced to flee and he goes over to the eastern side of the Jordan, and then there's a drought and he's forced to move again and ends up in the region of Tyre and Sidon at Zarephath. Now, Mark doesn't really make a strong connection with this, but in Luke 4, Jesus himself connects Zarephath with rejection by the Israelites, and then he is, at the end of that episode, also forced to flee. So there is in the Gospels a connection between this idea of the rejection of Elijah and Jesus that forces them to flee. There's a connection between that and this region in which this scene takes place. So there is again, while it's not exactly the same thing, there is a fairly strong connection here. The third thing that we can look at is where this happens. Now, it's interesting in this regard that Elijah starts off in Gilead, and Gilead is in the heart of the area that in the time of Jesus is known as the Decapolis. So Elijah goes from the Decapolis to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Jesus goes to the region of Tyre and Sidon and then goes to the Decapolis. So the same two areas are involved, although the sequence is reversed. So there's a significant connection there in terms of geography as well. And now, what is the nature of the miracle that's performed? Well, in the case of Elijah, he restores the child, the widow's child, to life. In the case of Jesus, he drives out the demon from the child and restores the hearing and speech of the man, but doesn't restore anyone's life. So the connection is loose here. The connection is primarily in terms of a miracle being performed for Gentiles because he wasn't received by the Israelites in each case, Elijah and Jesus. What about the result that follows from this? Well, in the case of Elijah, we have a clear statement that Elijah was recognized as a man of God. In the case of Jesus, there's no real ending to the first one, but the second one kind of ties them both up by saying that Jesus is one who is recognized as one who has the power to heal. And so there's a certain recognition of who Elijah and Jesus are as a result of these events that is explicitly stated in the text. Now, there's another interesting miscellaneous point here, and that is when Elijah first goes to Zarephath, what he does is multiply food. So he keeps the widow and the child alive when there's a famine there. And interestingly, in the gospel account, the event that follows this miracle is the feeding of the 4,000. So here we have Jesus performing a miracle of multiplying food, just as Elijah had performed a miracle of multiplying food at Zarephath. And finally, we would probably want to note the fact that there's a very broad connection in the Bible outside of this text between Elijah and Jesus, including, of course, the fact that Elijah appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration. And we don't have time here to trace out all the connections between Elijah and Jesus outside of this particular text, but it is noteworthy that there are so many connections between Elijah and Jesus. And so I think that's what makes this idea of Jesus as the fulfillment of the foreshadowing of the prophets of the Old Testament particularly appealing. Now, I think you could do a good sermon on interpreting this miracle in terms of just the evidence that Jesus is the Messiah. You could, particularly if you're focusing on the first part, focus on the compassion of Christ. You'd have to deal a little bit with why Jesus seemed to be hesitant. The answer to that is clearly that these are among Gentiles, and that comes out in the text itself. I think the announcement of the arrival of the kingdom works well. You've got two of the three elements that are regularly associated with the restoration of Shabbat in the Old Testament here. And so that points to Jesus as the one who has brought about the age of fulfillment. But because there are so many possible connections between Jesus and Elijah and the miracle that Elijah performs at Zarephath and the things that Jesus does here in the Decapolis and in the region of Tyre and Sidon. Frankly, I think I'm particularly interested in this text in approaching this as Jesus as the fulfillment of all the prophets who were before him, who foreshadowed him, and now he has come to fulfill what they were sent to do. So I think you could build, as I said, a good sermon on any of these points, and I hope that examining this has given you an idea of how we can better understand the role of miracles in the Bible, how we can read them more intelligently, and how we can preach them more effectively. I'm Dr. David Adams, and I thank you for joining me for this session.